Hey guys, have you heard of Goldbelly? It's this amazing site where they ship the most iconic, famous foods from restaurants across the country, anywhere, nationwide. I've never found a more perfect gift than food. They ship Chicago deep dish pizza, New York bagels, Maine lobster rolls, and even Ina Garten's famous cakes. So if you're looking for a gift for the food lover in your life, head to goldbelly.com and get 20% off your first order with promo code GIFT.
Support your immune system with Airborne's most complete immune support formula yet. Airborne's delicious effervescent tablets are packed with 7 powerful ingredients to fill the holes your immune system may have, so that you can enjoy those unmissable moments in your life. Learn more at airbornecomplete.com. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
Hello, I'd like to tell you that my name's Simon Brew. However,
who I am is none of your concern, and what I do is out of your control.
this is Film Stories.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always. That's everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, is given away by the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories. All those ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. Try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation that somehow, films manage to get made. Each regular episode of Film Stories, of which this is one, I cover 2 films and get into the stories of both of them, which is, all the preamble we need. Here's a clip of the first of the 2 films, this particular extract being one that was snipped out of the version of the movies that was played on airlines around the world. See if you can work out why. Come to the story, the other side of this.
Uh-oh, because there's an airplane out there.
Yeah, that's right, and everybody's boarding. Let's go.
Airline travel is very dangerous.
But don't be silly. It's the safest travel in the world. You're going to love this. Trust me.
Yeah.
Now, come on.
Oh, no.
Ray.
Yeah.
We're in an airport. People fly out of airports. What do you think we were doing here this whole time?
Yeah, flying's very dangerous. 1987, there were 30 airline accidents, 211 were fatalities, and 231 were definite passengers.
Yeah, well, this plane is very safe, believe me. Now, I got to get to LA and I don't have time for this shit.
Yeah.
Come on.
I
Ray,
don't know. I don't know.
You don't know?
No.
What, is it this airline?
Yeah.
Is it this airline?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. We can, there's an American plane.
American Flight 625 crashed April 27th, 1976.
We don't have to take American. There's a lot of flights.
Yeah, it's another airline.
Continental.
Continental crashed November 15th, 1987. Flight 1713, 28 casualties.
This is very serious, Ray.
Yeah, very serious.
You see, I have to get to Los Angeles, all right? So you're gonna get on that plane. Do you understand me?
Yeah.
You're gonna have to get on a plane.
Yeah, get on a plane.
Yeah.
This is the story of 1988's Rain Man, directed by Barry Levinson, screenplay credited to Barry Morrow and Ronald Bass, story to Barry Morrow, and starring Dustin Hoffman, Tom Cruise and Valeria Golino. I want to just, before we get into this, note up front that Rain Man is a film that through modern eyes is quite difficult, really, for all of its qualities, because at the heart of its story is a depiction of a man presented with autism. Now, as someone from a very neurodiverse household, I can say with some confidence that as much as Rain Man depicts one version of autism, that is by distance not the experience of the vast majority of people. Because what it has at the heart of this film is what's known as an autistic savant character. And an autistic savant, I mean, it's a syndrome defined as where someone displays exceptional ability in one specific domain. So I think it's worth talking about that up front, and also acknowledging that at the end of the 1980s, the word autism and any understanding of autism was, I mean, very much the exception rather than the rule. And I should acknowledge lots of people became aware that autism was even an inverted commas thing as a result of Rain Man. So its depiction of autism has come in rightly for a great degree of controversy. However, the fact remains that somewhere deep in the ether, it was the film that introduced autism at all to a whole bunch of people. So let's dig into the film stories. The film story itself. Its origins lie with a man whose name I mentioned just before, Barry Morrow. So Barry Morrow was the person who came up with the story in the first place, and he based it around two men really that he'd met. One was called Bill Sachter, the other was called Kim Peek. So, I mean, in the case of Kim Peek, he had been diagnosed with autism at one stage, although whether that diagnosis was actually correct has historically now been thrown into some doubt. But what is less debated is the fact that Kim Peek was defined as a mega savant, thanks to his exceptional memory. He also had severe social difficulties as well, and Barry Morrow met him and chatted to him. In fact, Dustin Hoffman would meet him and chat to him as well. Before that, though, there was Bill Sachter, and this was a man that Morrow drew on for an earlier project, a 1981, I think it was, television movie called Bill. Not Bill with the Incredible Horrible Histories cast, the wonderful family movie that came out over here in the UK, but just a TV movie about the life of Bill Sachter, about Bill Sachter, starring Mickey Rooney as Bill Sachter, and Dennis Quaid played Barry Morrow himself in the film. And so Morrow took both of those men and started to fashion a script for what would become Rain Man, a film that at one stage looked to be on an incredible fast track, because, I mean, it was 1984 that Morrow had his conversations with Kim Peek, and like by the mid-1980s, we were coming to a point where it looked like Rain Man was going to start shooting at the end of 1986. So, as per Variety, the film was up and running with Midnight Run and Beverly Hills Cop director Martin Brest attached to the film. He hadn't done Midnight Run at that stage, but still, any excuse to name check Midnight Run, right? And the first potential casting choices for the two brothers at the heart of the film were the Quaid brothers. That'd be Randy and Dennis, who were going to play the two lead characters. And so the script that Morrow put together was working. It was less about the autistic savant thread that the film would utilise. It was more about the relationship between the two brothers. I mean, Barry Morrow would, there was an implication really, I think it might come from him, that he didn't really fully understand autism, but he could lock in as a storyteller to the tale of these two brothers at the heart of it. Now, just to set the scene for the next bit of the story coming up, there was a producer by the name of Mark Johnson. This is in, 1977, I think it was, and an upcoming stand-up comic called Barry Levinson, who was also doing some writing work. Johnson wasn't a producer at this stage, he was soon to be, but the pair of them were very early in their film careers when they were hired by Mel Brooks. And Brooks used them on his Hitchcock spoof, 1977's High Anxiety. And on that film, Johnson would be the second assistant director, getting his experience in. Barry Levinson, meanwhile, was hired as an on-set writer, one of 3 or 4 on-set writers that Brooks used during the making of High Anxiety. And the pair of them soon became friends. And so when Barry Levinson then made the jump to writing and directing his own films, he would ask Johnson to produce them. And that's exactly what happened. The wonderful film Diner was the first fruits of this, a film that Johnson produced, that Levinson wrote and directed, a terrific film that turned into a profitable but also crucially a surprise hit for MGM. So let's go back to Rain Man, which was also coming together at MGM. The original script had been written, and then Ronald Bass by the mid-1980s had also been hired to do a rewrite. But in terms of the casting, it was no longer going to be the Quaid brothers, and it was Creative Artists Agency, CAA, that got involved and sent the script to some of its clients. Now, by the end of the 1980s, CAA would have a reputation for packaging movies, that it would get the script, it would get the director, it would attach stars, and then it would take those out to a studio, and the studio could buy a fully developed project pretty much off the shelf with a fat fee to CAA as part of it. There's a film, I think it was Ivan Reitman directed, a comedy, Father's Day, which I've mentioned once or twice, came out in 1997. It's not a good film, really. But they were able to take that package of Robin Williams and Billy Crystal and Ivan Reitman to Warner Brothers, and Warner Brothers pretty much bought that film off the shelf. That was the kind of packaging that CAA was doing. In the case of Rain Man, it sent the screenplay to both Dustin Hoffman and Bill Murray, with the idea that the pair of them could headline the movie and play these brothers. This was during Bill Murray's 4-year absence from the big screen, though, which may account for why he never really pursued the role. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the development was ongoing, that by the middle of 1987, Michael Bortman had come on board to do a script rewrite. Eventually, Martin Brest would step away from the film, and the rewrites were coming as part of his departure from the movie. But look who was coming in next. That would only be Steven Spielberg, off the back of acclaim for 1985's The Colour Purple, which was nominated, I think, for 11 Academy Awards, but notably not for Best Picture. Spielberg had done Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom a few years before as well. We've talked about that before. A big commercial hit, but a very dark film, and far from Spielberg's favourite of his films. And there was a clear, by the choices that he was making, there was a clear sense that Spielberg was looking for more, inverted commas, serious projects. The Colour Purple was one. Empire of the Sun was another. He would do one of his least seen, actually, studio films, Always. That was towards the end of the 1980s as well. But for the purposes of this story, he was attached to Rain Man for a period of time, and it was going to be a movie that he directed. Spielberg would stay attached to it as well for several months and would be working on developing the story, developing the film. But then he found himself with a conflict, and that would hit towards the end of 1987 because Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade was coming together, that Harrison Ford had a gap in his schedule to make that, and if Spielberg was going to do Indiana Jones 3, well, he would need to drop out of Rain Man. And it's not as if Rain Man would wait for him, because MGM wanted this film fairly quickly at this point, and if Spielberg wasn't going to do it, then it would have a look elsewhere, see who else would fancy taking the film on. And so it was some reluctance, really, that Spielberg stepped away from Rain Man to go and make Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. And that was when, at the end of 1987, when Sidney Pollack, for a brief period of time, came in and took a look at the film as well. Now, Pollack had directed Hoffman, of course, in Tootsie. What a film Tootsie is. I don't think anyone's got a bad word to say about that. But he didn't stick for whatever reason with Rain Man, and so MGM was quickly looking for another director to come in at a point where it was weeks ahead, really, of wanting to actually start shooting the movie, because there were things happening in 1988 that made MGM want to push the accelerator a little bit. I'll come to those just very, very shortly. So the offer went in to Barry Levinson and to Mark Johnson as well. MGM had worked with them off the back of Diner, and when they got this offer, the problem was they would have 9 weeks to get the film prepared and shooting. However, it was nowhere near ready, and so Ronald Bass would be rehired to come in and have another go at the script, but it was really a race against time to get the film ready for the start of production. Now, Barry Levinson, since Diner, had done particularly well for himself. I mean, look at Good Morning Vietnam, which I've covered once or twice before on this podcast. And so with Johnson and Levinson now on board, there was just a feeling that the film could actually get made. But in the background, there was a writer's strike on the way. This was building up in 1988, that the Writers Guild of America was looking to damn pens if it couldn't reach agreement with Hollywood high-ups. And inevitably, it didn't, never seems to happen. And what this meant was there was a race against time to get any necessary writing work completed, because as soon as the strike kicked in, no writers, no WGA members would be able to write scripts. They wouldn't be able to do rewrites, they wouldn't be able to do polish it, they wouldn't be able to write scripts. And so this meant that Ron Bass and his typewriter were just glued together for a bit, and Bass was working and working and working. And he got what was described as a partial draft together when the strike began. He delivered the last few pages just ahead of the strike starting, within hours of the strike starting. And then after that, he could not contribute another comma to the movie. That was that. The strike was ongoing while Rain Man was in physical production. So let's just go back a little bit to that casting, because Dustin Hoffman, by this stage, I mean, a smart casting on behalf of CAA, had been aboard for a good year or so, a little over a year, because Rain Man by this stage had been delayed. I mean, it was shooting some way after the original planned start date that MGM had. But also MGM had scored a coup by bringing in Tom Cruise, an actor at that stage who wasn't quite worldwide megastar Tom Cruise, but he wasn't far off it. Top Gun had happened at this point, had a very, very nice hit with the surprisingly dark, if you go back and watch it, Cocktail as well at this point. And it was seen as something as a coup, really, to land Tom Cruise opposite Dustin Hoffman in a film like this, because Barry Levinson has talked quite a lot in the past about who would greenlight something like this now. I mean, who would greenlight it then? I mean, it was no sure thing at all. It was just kind of a middle of the road movie. I mean, how would you describe it? How would you take it into the pitch meeting? But the quality of the script, or the quality of the story, had done enough to attract Cruise and Hoffman, and that was something that MGM could sell. Hoffman, for one, as well, had been through several directors on the film, and he would reflect to the New York Times that he felt it was the appointment of Barry Levinson that was key to Rain Man. He described how Barry was the first director who wasn't apprehensive about what I was telling him. Now, I should note, before getting too deep into this, that recently I've covered Outbreak, and on the film Outbreak, director Wolfgang Petersen did not find Dustin Hoffman particularly easy to work with, because Hoffman had a huge collection of questions, did an awful lot of research, and had an inherent insecurity, really, about his acting work. In fact, if you read the book about the making of Tootsie, it's the same as well, that Hoffman's process seems to be to semi-torture himself before he gets to a point where he can put his character on screen. So going back to what he was talking to the New York Times about, how Barry was the first director who wasn't apprehensive about what I was telling him and what I wanted to do. And Hoffman described how all the other directors, and I'm sure they've got other stories and other versions of this, to different degrees would say, am I hearing you right? You don't want to make eye contact with anyone in the movie. And another thing, you don't talk voluntarily. And Hoffman said the other directors would say, so how can we have scenes? They didn't know I was getting a lot of stuff off the people I was meeting, and was moved because Hoffman had thrown himself. He'd spent this year doing an awful lot of research. And he just said, we can find a code, we can discover the key and put it on paper. And the Charlie character can be part audience and discover the key. So Hoffman would then add that, he would explain that he's, quote, no expert on autism, but as the pre-production rehearsals on Rain Man were heading his way, he was just feeling the weight of what he'd discovered from his research. He wanted to put across something deeper that was on the page. And he said, I was very frightened because it was time to fish or cut bait. And he said the challenge then became to do what I always try to do, which is to bring it home and not try to do a character that is not myself, to find those autistic parts of myself, because I'm convinced that we're all a little bit autistic, just like we're all a little bit crazy. And there were pre-production rehearsals, and in those rehearsals, Cruise and Hoffman worked together, and at times, apparently, they took on each other's characters. There was a good chunk of improvisation between the pair of them as they built their characters up. And then on the 2nd of May 1988, some 13 months later than originally planned, Rain Man began shooting. And this was going to be a road movie. This was not going to be shot on studio sound stages. This was going to take in locations across America, working from that draft that Ronald Bass had sent in hours before the strike started, but also a draft that wouldn't necessarily correlate entirely to the finished film. Because here was an instance of really difficult circumstances of not being able... go back to that high anxiety story about how Mel Brooks had on-set writers. Rain Man couldn't have those. The strike was ongoing. You couldn't have them. And so what it meant was MGM couldn't ask for rewrites during the production. And Barry Levinson, this was music to his ears, really. And what it meant was it reduced the amount of studio interference. on the film. And MGM also needed the film out because it knew very well that the writer's strike was going to slow its output down. And here was a film with Tom Cruise in it, one of the most upcoming movie stars in the world at that point, and it wanted it ready for the end of 1988. Just to remind you, it started shooting on the 2nd of May 1988. MGM wanted it ready for the end of the year. And so this afforded Barry Levinson quite a lot of control, really. And he would explain that the key to the whole film for him was it was shot in continuity. And he said you could start seeing certain things. You could see the relationship and you could start adding things here and there. It just starts to click. And so what this meant was that Levinson had a degree of latitude to change the film around himself, that he would introduce new scenes, he would introduce new moments into the film, into the journey of these two characters. And because, again, he was shooting on location, it was quite hard for the studio to continually go out and see where he was next. And he was following the road trip of the characters, and he was putting in different destinations for the characters. And he would reflect over time that there was something really quite independent about the making of the film. And so, producer Mark Johnson would reflect to Grantland in 2014 in a look back at it all. And he got no sense really that what they had was some degree of lightning in a bottle. But he described how, I remember a few crew members came to me after a particularly poignant scene and said, this film's going to win an Oscar. And I said, what? I'm just hoping it gets through the gate. And so Johnson would also add that in the end, both Steven Spielberg and Sidney Pollack would give Barry Levinson a lot of credit for the way he trusted the material. And Johnson described some of the earlier drafts. He said there were drafts where a lot more happened, where the brothers are chased by a motorcycle gang, where Raymond, the character Raymond, figures out how to put together a motorbike and they run away, and just plot points. And Barry Levinson distilled this down to, quote, "This is two schmucks in a car." That's what he saw at the heart of the film. Two schmucks in a car, and he trusted the core duo. Now, the unlikely pairing at that point of Dustin Hoffman and Tom Cruise, that was paying off as well. As Dustin Hoffman would reflect, he said of Cruise, we're both very compulsive and monk-like. And he says, when we're shooting, we both like to work out, keep to a strict diet, not go out at night. And Hoffman described how Cruise would write his dialogue over and over in his own handwriting, as if they're your own words, until you feel you're the writer. And Hoffman had the same process when he was doing a recent production of Death of a Salesman. Hoffman also saw something of himself in Cruise because he said, for the first time, I was working with someone who was going through what I did 20 years ago, that first flush of stardom following The Graduate. And so Hoffman said we were linked into each other, which allowed us to be rough with each other. He said there's an emotionality between us that's very difficult to act, that permitted moments to happen between us. Filming would run through to July of 1988, and then it was racing into post-production to get the film ready for a December release in America. There was still problems. There was test screenings and there was screenplay arbitration. And so in terms of test screenings, the late Gilbert Gottfried used to talk about this on his podcast a lot, about how Barry Levinson would walk around for years later with a critical test screening card in his back pocket. And if any studio then gave him any problems or anything like that, in fact, Levinson is currently in post-production on another film called Alto Nights, due out in 2025, he could pull out the card and show just how far wide of the mark a studio test screening happened to be. In terms of the screenplay, meanwhile, that went to arbitration to sort the credits out, because Barry Morrow announced his plans, as LAH Exam would note in a report at the start of 1989, to submit the script for arbitration. And Ronald Bass rejected the idea at first, tried to give Morrow apparently a story credit only. Morrow refused this. He was in the end awarded the sole story credit and gets co-screenplay credit along with Ronald Bass in the final movie. Now, the film's test screenings aside, there was a feeling that this might be an Oscar runner just in the weeks ahead of the release of the film. So, I mean, let's take a look at that release. It landed in the production budget for it had been $25 million. It landed in American cinemas on December the 16th, 1988. Competitive year, as most of them are, and the response to it, when it first came out, was really quite something. In particular, these two characters at the heart of the film, Dustin Hoffman, these two performances, Dustin Hoffman's and Tom Cruise's. There is a school of thought, and I believe in this school of thought, actually, that the reason Rain Man works as a film, as much as Dustin Hoffman's performance was the one that gained lots of the attention, is because of Tom Cruise. I think you can say this of Jonathan Demme's movie, Philadelphia, as well, that Tom Hanks won the Oscar. It's actually Denzel Washington's performance in that film that makes it work. That notwithstanding, there was a clear response to the fact that there were two really strong acting performances at the heart of the film. And also, I mean, even though some of the reviews were a little hostile, a sense that they'd really captured something here and that it had really worked. And so, I mean, not the easiest film necessarily to sell. This wasn't even at that point your traditional Tom Cruise movie. But what was interesting about Rain Man was it's the kind of film that needed a curated Oscar release, in theory, that would build up its audience over time. However, it came out the traps a lot faster than had originally been expected. So let's look at that opening weekend, December the 16th to the 18th, 1988 in the US. Number one, Twins. I mean, how's that for the most high concept film of all time? Schwarzenegger, DeVito, Twins. Perfectly pitched. The film was on its second week. It was up to $22 million. Rain Man opened in second place with $7 million. This was 1988. That was a lot of money. It is still a lot of money for me. However, for Hollywood types, they might sneer at that now. $7 million, though, at that point. Yes, thank you very much. Third place was The Naked Gun. Fourth place was the film that Bill Murray did opt to make, Scrooged. It didn't have a great time making it either, as I've discussed before. Dirty Rotten Scoundrels was the other big opener that weekend, starring Steve Martin and Michael Caine, $3.8 million. And that was a decent hit in the end as well. Didn't set the world on fire, commercially at least, but still, these were the kind of numbers that were perfectly solid because you knew if you got a film that got a bit of word of mouth, cinemas would stick with it for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, which is exactly what happened with Rain Man. So if we go like 4 weeks up, let's go to like January the 6th to the 8th, 1989. So this is its fourth weekend on release. It's number one. And its box office is up. So it opened with 7 million on its opening weekend. Weekend 4, 9.2 million. This is the kind of thing that does not happen. Twins was still in second place, making lots of people lots of money. The other movies that have been around, The Accidental Tourist, Working Girl, Dirty Rotten Scoundrels was still in the chart. Tequila Sunrise, Oliver and Company, Hellbound, Hellraiser 2. And what was happening with Rain Man, though, was it was getting awards attention. Weekend 5, its numbers went up again, 10.1 million on its fifth weekend in release. And so, I mean, this was not behaving as films are supposed to behave. Weekend 6, it's still Rain Man and Twins, 1 and 2. Beaches was around by that point as well. Weekend 7, it's Rain Man in first, Three Fugitives in second place. In fact, it would be Three Fugitives that finally knocked it off the top of the chart. But by the time Rain Man completed its US release, $172.8 million, an incredible return for what could have been a low-key road movie, really. It also, what was interesting about Rain Man as well, this was the point where it wasn't a given that films like this would travel overseas, and yet it did roughly the same amount of money outside of America as well. An overall box office of $354.8 million for Rain Man. And, I mean, it didn't take long for the Oscar talk to really bubble up. But also, what was interesting was, at that point, the way the box office worked for Rain Man was enough to get the Los Angeles Times digging into this. And I found an article it ran in February 1989 that ran under the headline, "What's Driving Rain Man? Women." Imagine that. And it says in the article, the majority of Rain Man's audience were and continued to be female. This is a quote given by Craig Morrison, who was MGM UA's outgoing marketing president. And he explained the film is being driven by this solid core. There's no doubt, no question about it. Obviously, he said Tom Cruise accounts a lot for it. And what he said is, as you open a movie, you would very much like to have the interest reversed. This is such a 1980s quote. With 60% men and 40% women, because that's the standard, he said. Patriarchy, woohoo. He says, you won't find a lot of mega hits that are female-driven. In fact, 3 Men and a Baby had come out the year before, and the majority, a mega hit, the majority of the audience for that film was female. But 1980s Hollywood, the idea that Rain Man would have 60% women, 40% men watching the film, it didn't know what to do with that, and people were going on record saying, women going and watching films, what next? And there was also then, as it became clear it was going to attract towards attention, a mild moment of controversy on the day the Academy Award announcement came through, which was February the 15th, 1989, because MGM decided to print an ad in newspapers on the day of the nominations being announced that basically said it's an Academy Award nominee. And there was this led to a scandal at the time. Has someone leaked the Oscar nominees? But actually MGM just figured it had a certainty here that there was no way this was not going to get Oscar nominated, and so it kind of just got ahead of the publicity for the final run of the awards campaign season. I mean, its confidence was proven correct. That Rain Man in the end picked up, let's count them, 8 Academy Award nominations: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Screenplay, Best Art Direction, Best Cinematography, John Seal in there, Best Film Editing for Stu Linder, and Hans Zimmer's original score. It would win 4. It won Best Picture and it won Best Director. Dustin Hoffman took Best Actor, and arbitration's quite useful because the screenplay also won an Academy Award for Barry Morrow and Ronald Bass as well. Rain Man's reputation over time has, if you go back even like 5-10 years, that's when the articles started coming out questioning just really the approach of the film and its depiction of neurodivergence, and whether now through modern eyes is far more harmful than it is beneficial. The acknowledgement remains that it raised a lot of awareness, but was it, inverted commas again, the right kind of awareness? There's a lot of really good discussion and argument over that you'll find online, and it is worth reading into. It's also worth going to Steven Spielberg and an interview he did with the late, great Barry Norman in 1990. And at this point, Barry Levinson had his Oscar. Steven Spielberg didn't. Indiana Jones, The Last Crusade had been a mammoth hit, a really popular film. Again, covered that before. But Spielberg would admit to Barry Norman that he regretted really having to ditch Rain Man for Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade. But interestingly, he also acknowledged, and this was a point where it was will Spielberg ever win an Academy Award? I mean, he's won 2 since. But he also acknowledged that if he had been the director of Rain Man, I mean, first of all, inevitably, he'd have done it a bit differently. But he just felt that his name would have brought some baggage to it that might just have cost it its Oscar success. Are Academy Award voters that flippant? Who knows? I mean, it is not for me to say. What is clear, though, was that this is a film story where a confluence of circumstances that could have worked against the film instead very much worked to Rain Man's favour.
BTW, FYI. Visit Nexplanon.com RN to learn about Nexplanon. It's an gestural implant, 68 milligrams radiopaque. Or ask your HCP IRL. Okay, TTYL.
And that brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening and thank you for your time. If you like this podcast, I'm in parish notice mode now, so bear with me. But if you like this podcast and don't mind supporting it just a little more, I'm very, very grateful you've lent it your ears. Few ways you can do so. If you would like to financially support what I'm trying to do with Film Stories, if you head over to patreon.com/Simon Brew, put some money in the pot there. In return, you will get the podcast early regularly, pretty much every week. You'll certainly get it ad-free as well. You'll find out what I'm up to behind the scenes too. There are various things going on at the moment, not least the latest issues of our print magazines, which I shall plug just in a second. Costing you absolutely nothing is to review the podcast, ideally giving it a 5-star review and lots of happy praise. That would be massively appreciated if you could do that. And also just to hit the subscribe button or whatever the button looks like at your podcast home of choice. This podcast is independent. It is not backed by a major conglomerate. And so without the marketing spend or anything like that, all I have to spread the word is your word of mouth. So thank you so much to everyone who's had my back on that. It really is appreciated. I do have print magazines. More of them are incoming. I'm a huge print magazine nerd, and we do Film Stories magazine, which is the UK's biggest film magazine. It is 168 pages every issue. It's printed on really nice paper as well. Really proud of that. I'm happy for it to stand against any of the others out there for its paper size and paper quality, and also nerdiness in there as well. You can buy copies of it at store.filmstories.co.uk. And if there's a young film fan in your life, then Film Junior magazine is the only film magazine I know of that is in print, imagine that is aimed at under 15s, that also lets them write for it and earn money as well. Again, imagine that. That's at store.filmstories.co.uk. That's the end of my parish notices, though. Instead, what I'm going to do now is turn to the second of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories. I am very conscious that the writer, director and star of this film has been quite ill recently, so I do just want to point out before I get into this, I am punching down. I'm fascinated by people who put their hands in their pocket to make their own film. That's certainly what's happened here. Let me set things up with a clip from the movie in question. Going to come to the story, and what a story. The other side of this.
Is today the day you wish to confess your sins?
Not today. My sins are my own.
You heard about the incident in London?
Blake Molyneux.
He's extremely dangerous.
This is our chance. We must get Victor involved.
No one can do what he does.
I'm not the man I used to be. The Blackbird is dead.
The film in question here then is, depending how you date it, 2018 or 2022's Blackbird. This is directed by Michael Flatley, screenplay by Michael Flatley, produced by Michael Flatley, and starring Michael Flatley, Eric Roberts, Patrick Bergin, and Ian Beattie. And it was, unsurprisingly given that list of credits, something of a passion project for Michael Flatley. Now, the point I'm recording this is when Francis Ford Coppola is releasing the film Megalopolis around the world. Kevin Costner is in the midst of making his Horizons series of westerns as well. And so I'm innately just fascinated by the people who self-fund movies that other people wouldn't necessarily get off the ground for them. So in the case of Megalopolis, Coppola has sold a chunk of a vineyard. Costner, in the case of the Horizon movies, has mortgaged a beachfront property he happened to have. But with Michael Flatley, he earned a fortune off his dancing days, not least his Lord of the Dance show, which I will briefly mention shortly. But after his retirement from dance and his final Broadway performances, he's set to work really on writing a film that he really wanted to make. And this was going to be his first feature, and writing himself a role as a retired spy, a kind of James Bond-like really, who's lured back into the business. Now, as much as Flatley hadn't done a feature film before, he did have experience with a couple of short films, A Little Bit of Tear and Till Forever, but he was very much ready to embark on a feature at this stage. As he would explain to The Hollywood Reporter, I wanted to do it all my life, but I never had the opportunity. And he said, I remember when I was 6 years old in the backyard of our house in Chicago, we used to reinvent John Wayne movies with my buddies. And so Flatley set about getting to make the film made. And I mean, the first part of this film story is really quite boring and conventional. He wrote a script, he assembled a cast, and he started to get his film together. He would also put his own resources into the movie that was costing, £3-4 million to make. Patrick Bergin joined the cast. Ian Beattie, somewhat inevitably. Eric Roberts. The only reason I say that is Eric Roberts is fairly open about the fact that he assembles a lot of IMDb credits. Find a modern actor who's got more of them. And production could get underway on Blackbird in early 2018, with Flatley making his feature directorial debut as well as his leading man feature debut as well. Now, the shoot was extensive in terms of geography. It went to Ireland, England and Barbados, 3 locations where Flatley happened to have houses, but, fair dues to him. And so while it wasn't James Bond scale, it was certainly at the very least a film that looked at an atlas and thumbed through the pages, even if it didn't quite visit all of them. Clues to the production. I mean, most of it was done out of the glare of the world, really, but the clues to it were found in Flatley's Instagram account at the time, and the posts are still up there. So, for instance, in May 2018, he talked about, he posted a picture of examining the rushes from the film with headphones glued to his ears, and he described how this is going to be a great film. Later the same month, he was a picture of him laughing on set. They're all enjoying a light moment on there, and there he is, all dapper in his tuxedo. The month before, actually, was a clue to where some of the money had come from, because he posted a picture with a man called Mr. Young, and he described how, thank you for a very successful meeting, Mr. Young, of the Chinese film financiers of the movie. The group in question being the China Film Group Beijing, and he says, "You always take great pictures," said one fan at the bottom of the post. And, there was enthusiasm for this. There wasn't, as much as there were already a few people throwing not unreasonable questions as to whether this was a vanity project. The man was paying for it himself. He was living his dream. So be it. Now, Cine Europa reported the end of filming in an article that landed in, I think it's April, May 2018. And the suggestion then was that the turnaround was going to be quite quick, almost Rain Man quick, that Michael Flatley planned to debut the movie before the end of the year. And so, this film story, again, it's a nice calm one, isn't it? Screen Daily announced the end of production with a first look image from the film. And the pushback, relatively mild. The whole vanity project thing wasn't really building up at that stage, but it just depends on the movie. And so you go into post-production and things seem to be coming together quite nicely. Michael Flatley held a cast and crew screening of Blackbird in June of 2018, so he turned around his cut of the film relatively quickly as well. And then the excitement started to build as it was announced that the movie would be making its debut at the Raindance Film Festival, love the Raindance Film Festival, in the UK in September 2018. And as he approached the release of the film at Raindance, he talked about, "This is the first break I've had since retiring from dancing." He posted on his Twitter account, building up to that debut in the summer of 2018, a poster for the film, and he talked, the story was all upbeat and happy, how he dreamt of making a movie since he was 7 years old. And he wrote that nothing great is ever easy, but nothing is impossible. Talked again about it. I've wanted to do it for many, many years. Now's a really good opportunity to try it. I feel strong. I love this cast. I think we've got something special. So the first thing that didn't quite go to plan was the release of a poster for the film that was described as a little, let's just say, on the tone deaf side of things, because this was a poster that had Michael Flatley all besuited and looking all posh and dapper among a collection of, let's just say, less clothed younger women. And so it got to a point where Flatley had to deny he had anything to do with the poster himself, that was the marketing team. Still, it was a little bit of ink against the film. But again, nobody had seen it. And, he was a little bit defensive ahead of the movie's debut. Questions. He did an interview with The Hollywood Reporter where they did put the Vanity Project question to him. And he says, I'm well aware of it. He says, I want to be clear about this. I didn't finance it because I wanted to make a vanity project. It just would have taken too long to raise the money. And I didn't know what I'd be doing next year. It's also worth noting as well that Flatley had been writing and directing his own shows too, and he described to The Hollywood Reporter, when the window was there, we had to get it done. We've We've since had several offers, he said, already for people to come in and take the film, which is really good. So it won't be on my dime at the end of the day. And as it headed to its premiere at Raindance, he also told the Irish Post that we're already in pre-production for Blackbird 2 and for another film called Dream Dance. And he explained how we're starting to raise the finance for that now. And he would also confirm we've had several offers for Blackbird. We haven't decided on yet, but we do have several offers. Thank God, he said. So it was seen at the Raindance Film Festival. And then things went quiet. That there weren't reviews, that you go through social media, there weren't people at the screening talking about the movie. And the story of Blackbird really is one of how radio silence can make quite a noise in the end, because the movie would finally release to everyone else some 4 years after that Raindance debut. And not a lot have been heard of it since. So it did pop up at the Monaco Streaming Film Festival in 2021. Now, those of you who listen to Mark Kermode and Simon Mayo's podcast might note that they got quite interested in the Monaco Streaming Film Festival debut of Blackbird, because this was an online-based festival that in theory anyone could attend. But that particular iteration of the festival was described by the Irish Post as being, quote, beset by technical issues, one of which meant that attendees were actually unable to watch Blackbird unless you attended an in-person screening. So, I mean, if you weren't in Monaco, you couldn't watch this film at the Streaming Film Festival. And the whole idea of a Streaming Film Festival, well, you know, technical issues can happen to anyone, so let's go benefit of the doubt on him. Flatley, ahead of the film screening there, was understandably really happy as well. I mean, he told Variety at that point, I wanted to make a modern movie reminiscent of old Hollywood. And he described how the classics were always entertaining without being excessively violent or complicated. He would enthuse about how we shot the movie in Barbados, Ireland and London, capturing some of the most cinematically picturesque locations on film, all of which have a special place in my heart. And he said, I'm honoured to be showing Blackbird at the inaugural Monaco Streaming Film Festival. It's an innovative venture and it opens the doors globally to a rapidly evolving digital marketplace. Well, not only did the film debut, or at least screen at the aforementioned festival where you couldn't stream it, Flatley took home the Best Actor prize from the festival as well for his work in Blackbird. In fact, a report at the time quoted Nicola McGeady of Ladbrokes saying, quote, Michael Flatley's film has been well received, it seems. And after he scooped Best Actor honours in Monaco last night, it's not completely inconceivable that the Lord of the Dance star could land an Oscar. Now, the Kermode and Mayo podcast got in touch several times, or attempted to get in touch with the Monaco Streaming Film Festival and just tried to get footage or any acknowledgement that Flatley had been awarded the Best Actor gong. And so, I mean, you can dig into the archive of their podcast just to find out how far they didn't get, really. There was also an inference, actually, in a report in the Irish Post around the time that after the film had debuted at Raindance in 2018, that there had been a little bit of reshoot work, and so the film wasn't entirely the same as the one shown in 2018. But still, there was this whole, where's the film gone? That Raindance premiere screening and then at a streaming festival that didn't stream wasn't really a lot of chance for people to see the movie. And so this is something that intrigued a journalist at the outlet entertainment.ie, and the journalist's name is Brian Lloyd, and he posted a lengthy investigation in the middle of all of this just to try to get to the bottom of things. And in his extensive article, he writes, in all my years of working as a film critic and a journalist, I've never worked so hard to see a movie. But he couldn't find a screening. No one would send him a review screener, so he couldn't even watch it digitally. And actually getting a finished cut of the film, or a cut that he could see, was proving pretty much impossible. It's a really fascinating investigation that he posted as well. And boy, did he do his homework. He spoke to, he rang round the Irish distributors. Have you got Blackbird? none of them had it. He spoke to the production companies who were said to have been involved with it to some degree. Some had come in right at the end of the process. Some were, just names who might be putting the film out elsewhere around the world. And again, he was hit with, not an awful lot in return. He got tiny little bits of joy, but nothing really substantive and no sign of actually watching the film at all. He dug into that Raindance Film Festival premiere as well, and he discovered not a single review, not a single social media reaction to it. He spoke to Michael Flatley's executive assistant, apparently, who added that she initially told me, he said, that the movie was still in post-production and that there was no word on a release date. And Lloyd said, I asked her for a screener or a link, but no dice again. Now, what Lloyd was able to determine via his digging was that Raindance premiere was actually something of a private affair, that the vast majority of films at the Raindance Film Festival, particularly around this point, were shown at a cinema on Leicester Square. The public could buy tickets. I mean, that's the point at heart of a film festival. However, the screening that took place at Blackbird took place at a hotel in London in its screening room, and the tickets for it were not made available to the public. It sounded like it was an invite-only event. And so Lloyd tried to find anyone who'd been in that room. Apparently around 200 people were there. And again, you go on Michael Flatley's Instagram account, there is a picture and there's an image of this event taking place, but not a single bit of reaction from the film. I mean, has the film disappeared? Is it any good? Has something gone wrong? What's actually the story that's going on? Even the jury, in fact, of the Raindance Film Festival that year was said to have not seen the film, or certainly not judged it. I think Michael Flatley was the chair of the jury that particular year. And then the article started to appear online. Where's the movie gone? What's happened to this film? I mean, this was something that Flatley was not shy about putting forward when he was making the movie. And now there was this 4-year gap where there was really pretty much an absence of information. And I mean, we knew it had been shot. We knew it had been seen. We didn't really know anyone who'd seen it. I think, in fairness to Lloyd, he tracked down one person, I think it was, who'd seen the film, and they were not massively complimentary about it. However, where was the movie? And then out of the blue, it appeared. The announcement came in the summer of 2022 that Blackbird was finally going to get a cinema release. A first trailer was released as well. And along with the trailer, Flatley came out swinging for his film. Again, fair dues to him. And he said, I'm thrilled to be releasing Blackbird in cinemas across Ireland. He, not unfairly again, he said the pandemic has brought about many unprecedented production delays, but we're finally there. And he said, as well as filming on location in Barbados and the UK, we filmed many scenes in Ireland, so premiering here was always the first choice. There's nothing more breathtaking than the Irish landscape. And charity premiere screenings of the film were reported by RTE as happening around Ireland as well. Sinead O'Connor had written a track for the end of the film. And as Flatley said, we've all put a lot into this project, and for me, it's very personal. This was a new endeavour for me professionally and something I've always wanted to do. My mother, when she was alive, always encouraged me to pursue this dream. And he described how I've had great support from the industry, especially in Ireland, and winning Best Actor at the Monaco Film Festival, the Monaco streaming film festival that doesn't stream, at least that time, was very rewarding. So, September 2022, at last, the film was released. It was put in front of critics. Flatley did a very, very limited number of interviews for the movie. But if there were alarm bells that the film had disappeared, there were more alarm bells when people put their eyes on it. It would be fair to say that the critical response to Blackbird was not positive, and if there had been any hint that Blackbird 2 was still likely to be a thing, yeah, it didn't take long. Let's just put it that way. Mark Kermode, again, I've talked about him on the podcast. When he finally got to see the film, he did describe it as one of the worst films he'd ever seen. You didn't have to look far to find 1-star reviews of the movie. And, I mean, as much as Michael Flatley's hats were praised, the whole this is a vanity project thing was just being fired repeatedly in his direction. Now, there has been a little bit of a cult following of the film since, but it would be fair to say that off the back of its cinema release, the film did not do an awful lot of money. That it underperformed really in Irish cinemas. It struggled in UK cinemas as well. And I mean, as much because this was privately funded primarily, it was quite hard to find out how much everything had cost. And in the end, it was the Times who dug into the accounts that were filed in London for the company financing the film, which had shown that it had cost around $3 million to make, and it did not recoup that amount of money. This was not a box office hit at all. I think it did about €140,000 between the UK and Ireland. And as much as it's a globe-trotting spy movie, the film did not trot the globe itself. Flatley has been ill in more recent times, and so has had far more challenging things to deal with than the reaction to a movie. I do want to acknowledge that. I do think it's important. And we are in an era now where there are certain films where if you want to make them, you've got to put your hand in your pocket and pay for them yourselves. However, there are an assortment of lessons you could take from Blackbird, which is building up something of a cult following, but perhaps not for the reasons that Flatley intended. And that is, if you are going to write it, if you are going to direct it, if you are going to produce it, if you are going to star in it, well, sometimes it's not too bad to ask for a little bit of help. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening and thank you for your time. If I've not bored you completely, you can find me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Simon Brew. You can find Film Stories on Twitter and Blue Sky at Film Stories. Film Stories Magazine UK on Instagram. We're on YouTube. I'm doing loads on YouTube at the moment. youtube.com/Film Stories, where you can see the state of my shelves and how many magazines and Blu-rays are pouring off them, as well as the occasional terrible t-shirt. youtube.com/Film Stories for all of that. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, that's where you can buy all of our print magazines, apart from the ones that are sold out. That's Film Stories and Film Junior. I think we've got nearly 70 issues of magazines up there now. Really, really proud of what we managed to do there. Again, thank you to everyone who supported us there. If you go to www.filmstories.co.uk, meanwhile, that is our entertainment website. That is clickbait free, which is a really hard thing to do in the current world. It's got films, TV, news, features, reviews, all that kind of stuff. It's updated every weekday. We work really hard at it not to do clickbait. If you can support and you can spread the word, that is much appreciated. For now, though, I'm going to leave you in peace. As always, I've outstayed my welcome. So, the main thing is you all take care. You all look after yourselves. You all keep your health and sending you all the very best. I will be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, take care all. Bye-bye.